A week ago I showed you the step-by-step on how to paint a face. Today I'll work on the rest of the model, mainly showing how to get the most out of your metallic paints. So for the chainmail, you'll see me mix some black ink into the metallic paint. When we mix color into metallics, the flakes will be more dispersed on the new mix, since we end up with a larger volume of paint but the amount of metallic flakes remains the same. However, this will be imperceivable unless you go too overboard. Plus, if the mix is used for base coating, which will be highlighted later, it will actually work on our favor. You don't necessarily have to use inks for this. With the dark blue acrylic, I'll be tinting the same metallic, but for the armor plates. However, the lower pigmentation of acrylics compared to inks will mean that more color needs to be introduced for a higher value color result, which will reduce the shine of the armor. Yet in this case, I'm just looking for a slight tinting, which will then be highlighted with the unmodified metallic paint. The rest of the model was base coated before moving on to highlights. Having tinted the metallics with color before, the base tone can now be used to return the shine. For the chainmail, I unload as much paint as possible from the brush and proceed to lightly go over it, catching only the rings. Same principle as if dry brushing, but in a more controlled way. For the rest of the armor, I'll focus on those parts where my lamp reflects the light, as well as placing my brush sideways to catch any edges. If you have seen my gold painting tutorial, then you already know how this goes. If you are still not confident enough to try out non-metallic metal or just don't have enough time for it, this process follows the same principles, and it is aimed for those painters who want to take the next step. Maybe not something you'd do for an army, but to consider when working on characters which deserve more than a base coat and a wash. For those wondering which metallic I'm using, this is Duraluminium from Vallejo Metal Color. Because this comes ready for airbrushing, they are quite liquid, like you might have spotted during the color tinting. So when working with this type of paint, it is important not to oversaturate your brush, or you'll find the paint runs down everywhere. But if you work with the classic, let's say Lead Belcher or Stormhold Silver from Citadel, you won't run into this problem. The final thing to do before finishing the armor is to establish some deep shadows, in order to better separate each panel from one another, as well as from other parts of the model like the gloves. For it, I'll heavily dilute the dark blue I used before with a very dark brown, basically creating a dark brown wash but adding a tint of blue to it to keep it within the color scheme. If you count with proper washes, feel free to use them. I'll keep it simple, using paint and water. It is important the application is targeted towards the recesses we want to darken down. Applying this all over the armor would have more paint settle on the recesses, but the thin layer of paint that would remain over everything else would kill the shine, which is not something I'm looking to do for this particular paint job. This washing step could be done after the base coat so as to avoid having to correct any overspill. And here is our metallic armor with its light blue tinting and shadows. I'll showcase one more thing from this paint job, first for the sword. Over where the light of my lamp doesn't reflect, I'll layer glazes of dark blue paint. The consistency is the same as the one of the wash, but the brush has been unloaded in order to apply only a thin layer of paint. Multiple applications will be required to achieve a higher value. To create a gradient, each layer is shorter than the one before, but always finishing in the same spot where more paint will build up. For the other side of the blade, I did the same but on the middle. After readjusting the consistency and using a bit more blue than dark brown, I was left with a nice sky reflection. With the same glazing concept, though not as diluted as before, I used a lighter blue to build up highlights on the cape. Here you can better appreciate how thin the paint is, and how with each pass the color builds up more and more, while the area of application becomes smaller. Being this thin, it'll take the paint 30 seconds at most to dry before you can move on to the next coat, or instantly if you count with a blow dryer like I did. I chose this approach just because I didn't feel like mixing both blue tones, but it is another out of many ways you can approach smooth transitions. If your transition layers are not smooth enough, you can tidy them up going back to the base dark blue color, and applying one or two thin layers to blend everything up, just like we have done before. Using a combination of homemade flocking, I based the model and was left with this. A big thank you to everyone who commented wanting a part 2 on this model, and I hope it met your expectations. Next week we're going back to the grimdark style, so see you then.